With Update 2.2 now in full swing and WuWa's 1-year anniversary only a few months ahead, it's worth looking at the successes and shortcomings of WuWa's endgame content. The new endgame feature, Whimpering Wastes, has, rightly so, received some fairly harsh criticism, but this raises a major question. Can Kuro and Wuthering Waves solve the endgame problem and truly elevate itself out of the standard gacha game pitfalls? To investigate this question, some foundational information first needs to be established. Primarily, what is the endgame problem, why is it important, and what even constitutes as endgame content, especially for live service games that are perpetually ongoing with no clearly defined end to begin with. To start with, endgame content can be defined as any content that is either available after the main and side stories of the game are completed, or any content that requires significant investment in time or resources for the player to unlock and successfully complete. Endgame content typically is divided into two categories: casual content and challenge content. Challenge content is designed to test players' understanding and mastery of the core game's mechanics, often adding extra rules and gimmicks to pre-established mechanics in the game. This content usually offers impressive rewards as extrinsic motivators, progress indicators, and goals for players to work toward achieving, and most challenges are repeatable in some capacity, usually via timed reset. The Tower of Adversity and Whimpering Wastes are both examples of this kind of endgame content. In short, challenge content aims to encourage players to continuously be investing time and resources into their account so that they may successfully complete the content's more difficult levels and claim the rewards with each reset. Casual content, conversely, is more relaxing. This content may not even build upon the game's pre-established core mechanics, and the rewards, while present, are often less than what is in challenge content. The real reward for most casual content comes from intrinsic enjoyment for the game modes themselves. Players are often encouraged to be creative or given a wide range of freedom to engage with the content, whereas challenge content sets clear goals for players via its difficult levels. Casual content tends to leave it to the individual players to define what progress is for themselves. Players are encouraged to repeat the content at their own leisure, and there often aren't as many, if any, timed resets. Game modes like Genshin Impact's rinascita or the TCG are fine examples of this type of endgame content. The endgame element of it comes from the fact that players often must complete certain story quests and benchmarks before actually unlocking the content altogether. Between these two types of endgame content, there are three common components: repeatability, definable goals, and motivators, both extrinsic and intrinsic. Thus, the endgame problem for developers is the issue of weaving together and balancing these three components to create satisfying and perpetual endgame content for players who have completed all of the story and event content. Now, in a standard video game, endgame content typically comes in the form of post-game content, or DLCs. For these games, this endgame content can be finite. Players can experience it, complete it, and then simply move on to a sequel or a different game entirely. However, gacha games are live service games, constantly updating and desiring players to return to the game so as to maintain the longevity of the game itself. By their very nature, live service games need to keep players invested in playing over a long period of time, often years. Because of this, content is trickled out in the form of periodic events or ongoing story content. While these do encourage players to return to the game once completed without further content, players are apt to abandon the game and not play regularly during the interim. This is why endgame content is far more critical to live service games. It gives players goals and reasons to continue logging in daily during the interim between updates. It's crucial for establishing and maintaining a core audience for the game. However, what most endgame content fails to achieve is investing players for long play sessions. Sure, the content can get players to return daily, but are players truly invested if they only log in for a few minutes a day to do daily content, complete a short challenge, and then claim the rewards? This creates a routine, but so too do daily obligations and chores. And that is what the current state of endgame content tends to be in gacha games. Repetitive chores. And so the critical endgame problem exists. The problem for developers to create perpetual endgame content that can invest the player both for the long term and for long play sessions while waiting for new main story and event content. One of the challenges for addressing the endgame problem is the disconnect between what players want and what game developers want. Yes, game developers want to make amazing and fun games for players, but at the end of the day, they work for companies, and companies need to prove that the games they publish can produce profits for shareholders. Because of that, the vast majority of endgame content, especially in WuWa, revolves around mechanics and gimmicks that align with the current banner characters. The Tower of Adversity and Whimpering Waste both have special buffs that tend to align with specific character elements to encourage players to pull for the current banner characters. This fact is somewhat of an accepted necessary evil amongst the player base, but it leads to larger problems in the overall design of endgame content. Artificial difficulty, and timed resets. Most of the current endgame content in Wuthering Waves can be boiled down to a timed DPS check against either an overly buffed boss or multiple waves of smaller enemies. On the surface, the DPS check and timer may seem as just a means to gauge the player's investment in their characters and teams. However, this is an example of artificial difficulty. There's nothing inherently more challenging to the player if the enemy has more health, does more damage, or needs to be defeated within a certain amount of time. These don't adequately gauge the player's understanding of the game's mechanics or complex design choices. They're simply additional numbers. And perhaps even more dangerously, the gradual increase of these numbers facing off against players invites power creep into the game as a means of combating the artificial difficulty created. This leads into the need for constant resets on endgame content. Weekly, bi-monthly, or even every update, some form of endgame content resets and puts the player back at the start. After a while, this becomes tedious and repetitive. The challenges provided become little more than timed chores to complete before the next reset, and because of that, engagement drops while burnout seeps in. These choices of numbers and resets are, frankly, cheap and lazy design practices for endgame content challenges. Now, I'm not suggesting that Kuro completely reworks the Tower of Adversity or Whimpering Wastes. Those are already in the game, and some players do enjoy them. However, going forward, Kuro should try to avoid these common pitfalls in design for future endgame content. Players want Wuthering Waves to innovate, as it is already shown that it can. But what do these innovations look like? What general guidelines could satisfy a wide array of players? 3 main points should be evaluated as the criteria for creating satisfying endgame content: continuous progression, expansion of mechanics, and enjoyment and rewards. These 3 criteria cycle back to the 3 common components of endgame content. Enjoyment and rewards are the intrinsic and extrinsic motivators for players, respectively, and expansion of mechanics can facilitate the creation of new game mode-defined milestones for the player to achieve while opening the game mode up for potential player-defined goals. And continuous progression allows for the removal of timed resets to achieve repeatability, and instead gives the player a constant feed of new content to engage in. But what does this all look like in practice? How is one to know that these ideas can even work? The answers to these questions can be found in another game. At the time of recording this video, Capcom has recently released a new entry into the Monster Hunter series, Monster Hunter Wilds. For those uninitiated with the series, the general gameplay loop is quite simple. Players fight big monsters to carve up and use as materials to create bigger and stronger weapons and armor, to then fight bigger and stronger monsters. A major way that the simplicity of this gameplay loop is made engaging is by providing continuous progression to players. Players initially progress through early story content or low-rank hunts to learn the basic mechanics of hunting monsters and using materials to craft new armor and upgrade weapons, the latter using a literal progression tree. Post-credits, this progression doesn't simply reset. It instead continues by expanding the previously established mechanics with high-rank hunts. While this includes a soft reset by making old monsters stronger, it also includes numerous more monsters, armor options, and weapon upgrades. The way players even go about hunting can change by including player-driven investigations. Players are encouraged to set their own goals and given the freedom to engage in the post-game content however they choose. The game provides a post-game story for clearly definable milestones, but how and when the player decides to approach them is left to the player's own personal freedom. The game is entirely goal-oriented, and a large portion of this comes from the player's own desire to create their own goals, whether that be in upgrades, unlocking new features, gaining titles, or simply mastering new weapons. This self-driven, goal-oriented approach to Monster Hunter's endgame content facilitates intrinsic motivation for players to continue to engage in it. There is an intrinsic joy in mastering the high skill ceilings for new weapons, and more importantly, the actual gameplay is fun. It's enjoyable to hunt big monsters. This intrinsic joy is only amplified by the extrinsic rewards, the materials to continue upgrading, or the unlocking of even more features and mechanics. And the extrinsic rewards factor back into the continuous progression of expanding mechanics. The player never truly feels bored because there's always something new to learn or experience. This truly makes the gameplay repeatable, and no timely resets are needed for this. The amount of hours that players put into these games is evidence of this. Everything that makes for satisfying endgame content is on full display here.
Together we stand. Bluebird.
So, what does all of this look like in the context of casual and challenge endgame content? And does Wuthering Waves have the foundations to achieve this? As the foundational mechanics of WuWa are combat-oriented, challenge content is the easier start for answering these questions. Currently, all of WuWa's challenge content involves timed resets to induce repeatability, and while this is generally accepted for the Tower of Adversity, going forward with new game modes, offering continuous progression that unlocks new challenges indefinitely until full completion and subsequent additive updates should be the standard. These new challenges should also not simply be timers, increased numbers, and other forms of artificial difficulty. Players need to be tested on evolving mechanics as a challenge. To a small degree, this can already be seen in the recent hologram challenges. As players progress each level of the hologram, the enemy progressively gets stronger. While a portion of that is due to increased enemy levels and stats, the latter challenges of each hologram boss include new attack patterns and mechanics for the player to adapt to. Those are examples of actual difficulty, and they are a key reason why the holograms are a major challenge for a lot of players. That and getting virtually one-shotted. Having more challenge endgame content that takes enemies, even smaller ones, and expands on their attack patterns and abilities tests players' ability to adapt to these new mechanics. And this is simply one example based off of a single foundation currently in WuWa. Imagine if this idea was expanded to the Whimpering Wastes game mode. As players progress, instead of just more waves of enemies on a timer, artificial difficulty, enemies attack differently, coordinate, or even have bosses appear. New mechanics building off of the previously established and familiar mechanics, revolving around team building and swapping, perhaps testing players and creating a continuous barrage of attacks mid-swap, could replace the standard elemental gimmick effects for stages. This would then offer a greater sense of freedom for players to build their teams and use their preferred characters. Even adding co-op modes for these challenges could help with the team building and the unique feel of the game mode due to having multiple characters on the field at once. These new challenges also offer the player a sense of satisfaction in completing, the intrinsic motivation for engaging in the content, instead of a feeling of tedium due to doing the same thing again because of resets and a lack of unique gameplay. Naturally, the extrinsic rewards don't need much of a change. Wuthering Waves has consistently been quite generous with their rewards for players. And while it is easier to see the foundations of these ideas in the current challenge endgame content, it is likely easier to actually implement them in casual endgame content. As an example, WuWa's 2.1 fishing game mode is a good starting point. It's easy to imagine how continuous progression can be applied to the fishing game mode. For one, there already aren't timed resets, so everything is permanent to begin with. And secondly, it's easy to envision consistent updates that offer substantial additions to the game mode. Imagine if the fishing was broadened into the larger oceans between Jinzhou and Rinascita. This could include larger boats and ships, potential for co-op mechanics, deeper seas, and entirely new mini-games for catching and storing fish. The expansion of mechanics facilitates a natural sense of continuous progression so long as substantial updates are made. Players would have a plethora of different goals, both in the form of the game mode's own milestones and self-driven goals. Player freedom could come in the form of exploration, an open order to unlocking features and ship cosmetics, or the choice between co-op and single player. Naturally, extrinsic rewards like initial astrites or leveling materials should be included, but the primary motivator for this game mode would likely be the intrinsic joy of customization and freedom if fishing mechanics were expanded upon. The foundation for both casual and challenge endgame content is present in the game and should be built upon, but why do these types of content need to be mutually exclusive? Can a type of endgame content blend elements of both casual and challenge gameplay into one hybrid form of endgame content? For Kuro to truly innovate and expand upon previously established endgame content, the answer to this must be yes. Let's look back at our fishing game mode example. If all of the previously suggested ideas were to be implemented, it wouldn't be that much of a stretch to add in challenge content. If Kuro were to make use of the empty ocean between Jinzhou and Rinascita, one can only imagine that it may include sea monsters, pirates, and unexplored islands. As players progress through upgrading their boat and unlocking new ships, these regions featuring challenge content would unlock. The potential for aquatic and maritime combat would be an option to expand the current core gameplay mechanics into. Imagine having co-op boss raids against certain creatures in the ocean, or having pirates or TDs board the ship. There could be varied styles of challenges like defense or point captures. The foundations for these challenges are already in some of the game's current mini-games. This would offer even more freedom for players to choose how to engage with the content. The rewards, both intrinsic and extrinsic, would remain roughly the same. Enjoyment in the game mode and various cosmetics, astrites, and leveling materials for players. Of course, this is just a suggestion. I am sure that while there may be those interested in the idea, there are an equal number of people entirely opposed to it. The concept is simply an example to illustrate an implementation of the three main components and three main criteria of satisfying endgame content. But can Kuro do it? Can Wuthering Waves actually solve this endgame problem that plagued so many gacha and live service games? Multiple events of the past show that they've been tinkering with features. The progression of the fishing feature and the almost roguelike aspect of recent elusive realm iterations all illustrate this. But the structure of Whimpering Wastes shows that Kuro is still reluctant to fully step away from the familiar. Simple time and DPS check challenges with various reset dates are still the go-to for gacha games, Wuthering Waves included. For Kuro to actually push past this, they need to step away from what other games have done in the past. However, implementing such a feature like the previous example would take a tremendous amount of time and resources. It's likely on the same scale as building a game within a game, and no company is likely to risk that without sufficient demand. Players need to actively demand and call for Kuro to make endgame content that is continuous and doesn't reset all progress as a cheap way to provide new content. They need to actively demand and call for content that builds upon the game's previously established mechanics, while simultaneously offering players the freedom to express their own creativity with said mechanics. And players need to actively demand that the endgame content provide enticing rewards, both extrinsically in the form of materials or astrites, and intrinsically with the enjoyment of the gameplay itself. Endgame content shouldn't and doesn't have to feel like a tedious chore for players. Even players who enjoy the Tower of Adversity or the Whimpering Wastes game modes should still argue for Kuro to keep innovating. They're fairly good at it, and through innovations, Wuthering Waves can continue to push the boundaries further for what a gacha game can achieve. Thank you for watching. If you have ideas for what could be good endgame content, feel free to comment about them below, and most importantly, be sure to share those same ideas with Kuro in the frequent surveys sent to players. Kuro can certainly solve the endgame problem by tapping into their greatest asset, their players. Kuro listens to their players, so it's up to the players to help solve this endgame problem with them.